Jerome Bettis stepped into NFL history as one of the greatest running backs of all time, who accumulated over 13,000 rushing yards in his career. Placed among the most outstanding players who ever played this position, a symbol of the Pittsburgh Steelers with his powerful, enduring, and unstoppable playing style. He was selected to the Pro Bowl 6 times, won the Rookie of the Year title in his very first season with the Los Angeles Rams, and after many years of dedication, he was honored at the Pro Football Hall of Fame as the final affirmation of his legacy. But the moment that defined it all took place at Super Bowl 40, when he helped the Steelers win the championship right in his hometown of Detroit, closing out his career in the glory that any player could dream of. A perfect ending to a journey that lasted more than a decade in the harshest environment of American football, where every yard was earned through sweat, collisions, and sheer effort, and where he became the embodiment of resilience, a man who didn't need speed to dominate, didn't need flash to be recognized, but only the will to keep moving forward. But behind all those numbers, those titles, and those rounds of applause was another story. A story where his body never stopped fighting against him. When, from a young age, he had to live with asthma, a condition that turned breathing into a battle. And throughout his NFL career, every game was not only a confrontation with opponents, but also a war with his own chest, with the lingering pain, with the moments when his body felt like it was about to collapse. He was not the fastest, nor the strongest, but he was the one who refused to stop, even when every sign said he should. And perhaps what makes Jerome Bettis' story so heartbreaking is not what he achieved, but the fact that he had to endure all of it in silence, carrying the pain and continuing to run, not because he didn't feel the limits, but because he never allowed those limits to determine his fate. Before we continue with the story, please hit subscribe and leave a like, as a small way to honor a man who fought against his own body and never gave up. If the previous part was the image of a man standing at the peak, then this part must begin from the place where everything seemed almost impossible to start. When Jerome Bettis was still just a boy, growing up in the tough neighborhoods of Detroit, where life didn't allow anyone to be weak, but ironically, his own body was the weakest thing of all, not because of a lack of will, but because every breath for him was already a battle. Asthma attacks came without warning, tightening his chest like an invisible hand, making air a luxury he couldn't control. There were nights when the room became frighteningly silent, with only his gasping, broken breaths left, as if every inhale was a desperate effort to keep himself in this world for a few more seconds. And for a child, there was no greater fear than the feeling that his body no longer obeyed him, when you want to breathe but can't, want to run but don't dare, want to live normally but always have to be cautious of every smallest movement. Bettis's family understood that fragility better than anyone, and because of that, his life was never like other children's. Everything was tightly controlled, from food and schedules to what he was allowed and not allowed to do. His mother was always on high alert, monitoring every smallest sign from her son's body, as if one moment of carelessness could make everything collapse, while his father chose a different way, not allowing fear to become a reason to stop. He believed discipline could make his son stronger, and between those two extremes, Bettis grew up with a silent inner conflict. One side, fear of not being able to breathe; the other, the pressure to prove he wasn't weak. But the most painful thing was not the asthma attacks, but the feeling of being separated from the world around him, when other kids ran and jumped, laughed and played, breathing naturally without thinking, while he had to weigh every step, every activity, and ask himself if his body could handle it. Gradually, that gap was not just physical but became a distance in the soul, when he began to realize he was not like them, couldn't keep up with them, and might never belong to that world. There were moments when Bettis stood watching other kids play, not with loud envy, but with a quiet sadness, when he understood that the simplest things for others were distant for him. And that very silence made the pain deeper, because there was no one to share it with, no one who truly understood the feeling of being trapped in an incomplete body, a body that could betray you at any moment. There were nights he couldn't sleep, not because of pain, but because of fear. Fear that the next asthma attack would come. Fear that this time he wouldn't make it through. And that fear didn't disappear over time. It only changed shape. From the fear of not being able to breathe to the fear of not being strong enough, fast enough, good enough to survive in a world that always demanded more than what he could give. And it was from those fears that something began to form. Not confidence, but a stubbornness, a determination that didn't come from believing he would win, but from refusing to be defeated. Even when everything around him was saying he should stop, Bettis didn't become strong because he wasn't afraid, but because he had become too familiar with living with fear, every day, every night, every breath, and in a way, those seemingly weak years were the foundation for everything that would come later. Because when the child had to fight just to breathe, then fighting to survive on the football field was no longer impossible, but just another battle. A bigger, harsher one, but not unfamiliar. And perhaps no one could understand that before Jerome Bettis learned how to run past the biggest NFL defenders, he had to learn the most basic thing that many people take for granted, which is to keep breathing, to keep existing, and to keep living, even when his body seemed to not want that to happen. And as Jerome Bettis grew up, the fear no longer stayed only in the asthma attacks that made him struggle to breathe, but began to turn into a clearer, colder reality, that his body was not built to win in the world he was gradually entering. Because while others began to develop like ideal athletes, faster, leaner, more agile, Bettis became the opposite. Heavier, slower, and without the look of a running back that coaches dreamed of. No one looked at him and thought this was the future of football. No one looked at him and saw speed or explosiveness. They only saw a body that seemed unfit, a shape that went against every standard the sport set, and that made every step of his progress harder, not because he lacked effort, but because he had to fight against a prejudice that existed even before he had the chance to prove anything. The comments didn't need to be loud to hurt. They just needed to be repeated enough, persistent enough, and real enough to make a boy start believing they might be right, that maybe he really wasn't fast enough, good enough, or suitable enough to be here. And in training sessions, when others were noticed for their speed and ability to break away, Bettis had to work twice as hard just to be seen. But even when he was seen, what he received was not trust, but doubt, evaluating eyes, slight head shakes, decisions that kept him in a lower position, as if everything about him was a question that never had an answer. There were times he wondered what he was trying for, when everything around him didn't support him, when his body was not an advantage but a burden, when every run carried doubt, not only from others, but from himself. And that was the biggest conflict, not between him and opponents, but between him and his own body, between the desire to prove he was worthy and the reality that his body seemed not designed for it. But the scariest thing was not being underestimated, but the risk of accepting it, the risk of letting others' doubts become truth inside him. And it was at that point that Bettis made a silent choice that determined his entire later life. He didn't try to become the fastest, didn't try to change his body to fit others' standards, but began to learn how to use exactly what he had, turning weight into power, turning slowness into stability, turning every run into a collision that opponents couldn't easily withstand. But that process was not easy. It was not a moment of enlightenment, but a long series of failures, trials, and pain, when he had to learn to accept that he would never be like the others. And precisely because of that, he had to find a completely different way to exist. There were days when everything seemed not to progress, when he was still ranked behind others, still doubted, still questioned about his ability. And it was in those moments that Bettis's persistence didn't come from believing he would succeed, but from not accepting being eliminated, not accepting that his story would end before it truly began, and perhaps that was what made the biggest difference. Not talent, not physical ability, but a quiet will, a silent but firm refusal in the face of all prejudice, all limits, even his own body. And over time, when others began to realize that he didn't disappear, that he was still there, still continuing, still moving forward step by step, even if slower, even if heavier, but never stopping, then something began to change, not first in their eyes, but in Bettis himself, when he no longer saw his body as a betrayal, but as a challenge to overcome, something unchangeable but usable. And it was from that acceptance that a different kind of strength began to form. Not speed or agility, but endurance, stubbornness, and an ability to withstand that not everyone could understand. And perhaps at that time, no one could predict that the boy who was considered too slow, too heavy, too unfit, was gradually building a path that no one else could walk, a path not based on becoming the best by others' standards, but on never accepting being taken out of the game, even when everything, from the outside world to his own inner body, was trying to push him out of it. And then that journey brought Jerome Bettis to the University of Notre Dame, a place that for many was a dream, but for Bettis was another challenge, harsher, clearer, and with no room for excuses, because there every player had once been the best from where they came from. Every body had been honed to become more perfect, faster, stronger, and Bettis entered that environment not as an expected star, but as a name that had to prove itself all over again from the beginning. A person whose past was not enough to guarantee the future, and his body, with all the limitations that had followed him through the years before, did not disappear just because he had made it here. The first training sessions did not bring confidence, but brought a truth clearer than ever, that the gap between him and the others was still there, when their speed made everything easier, when their agility helped them adapt faster, while Bettis still had to struggle with every movement, every drill, every demand that his body could not always meet, and in an environment where opportunities were not given but had to be earned. Not standing out meant being left behind. Bettis was not seen as a star, not the name that coaches mentioned first, not the person that fans were waiting for. He was just part of the collective, a person who had to try twice as hard just to stand on the same level as the others. And there were times when that was not only physical exhaustion, but also a silent pressure weighing on his mind, when he began to wonder if everything he was doing was enough to change how others saw him or not. But Bettis had no other choice but to continue, because for him, stopping was not an option, and each day that passed, he stepped onto the practice field with the same determination, not to become the best right away, but to not be eliminated, to not disappear from the list of those who still had a chance, and that very persistence began to create small changes, small advances that no one noticed immediately, but enough for him to keep his place in the lineup. There were gains where Bettis was given the opportunity, and he did not do everything perfectly, did not explode like what people expected from a star, but he did enough to continue being trusted, enough to prove that he could contribute, and in an environment like Notre Dame, sometimes enough was already a small victory, because it meant that you were still there, still being given a chance, still able to move forward. But behind those advances was a reality that Bettis never escaped, which was that his body was always in a state of tension, pain, and endurance. Every collision, every acceleration, every time he was knocked down left traces, not only on his body but also in his mind, when he knew that he did not have the advantages like the others, that every mistake could make him lose the opportunity he had taken so much time to earn. There were days when he walked off the practice field with his body exhausted, not because he had done something special, but because just keeping up with the others was already an effort beyond his limits, and in those moments, Bettis did not think about fame, did not think about the future. He only thought about how to come back the next day and continue. Because if there was one thing that the years before had taught him, it was that surviving was sometimes more important than shining. Gradually, those around him began to realize that Bettis did not disappear, that he was not weeded out like many others, that he was still there, still continuing, still contributing. And although he never became the center of the spotlight at Notre Dame, he began to build something even more important, which was reliability, a belief that when needed, he would not give up, that he would do what was necessary for the team to move forward, even if it did not bring personal attention or glory. But even when he began to prove his value, Bettis was still never really seen as a star. There were still doubts, limits that others assigned to him, and perhaps that very thing kept him always in a state of having to fight, not just to move forward, but to hold on to his position, to not return to where he had once stood, where everything was fragile and could disappear at any moment. And when looking back, the years at Notre Dame were not where Bettis became brilliant, but where he learned how to exist in a world not made for him, learned how to accept that he would never be perfect, but could still be good enough, resilient enough, persistent enough to keep moving forward, step by step, on the path that no one believed he could finish. And then, after the years of existing in silence and non-stop effort at the University of Notre Dame, the door to the NFL finally opened for Jerome Bettis. When he was selected by the Los Angeles Rams in the draft, a moment that for many was the end point of the journey. But for Bettis was only a new beginning, harsher, faster, and less forgiving than any environment he had ever experienced, where every player was strong, was quick, was ready to take your spot if you slowed down even for 1 second. And in that world, Bettis stepped in with the same question that had followed him his whole life, whether this body was enough to survive or not. But right in his first season, he did what not many people expected. He not only survived, but stood out with over 1,000 rushing yards, becoming one of the most impressive rookies in the league and winning the Rookie of the Year title, a recognition that seemed to finally affirm that everything he had endured, all the years of having to prove himself, was not meaningless. And for the first time, the name Jerome Bettis was no longer placed in question, but mentioned as a real talent. But that recognition, no matter how big, was not enough to erase the doubts that had taken root before. Because in the eyes of many, he was still not the ideal model, still seen as too slow, too heavy, and not suitable for the NFL's increasingly speed-oriented style of play. And even when he ran through defenses, even when he scored, the questions did not disappear, but only temporarily subsided, waiting for the chance to return. Inside the team, everything was not as simple as the statistics showed, because the tactical system of the Los Angeles Rams was not really built to fit Bettis' style. They wanted speed, agility, quick bursts, while he was the type of player who needed space, needed time, needed collisions to create advantages, and that difference made him, even when successful, always in a state of having to adapt, to adjust, to try to become a version that he was not completely himself. There were games where Bettis played well, but still felt he did not really belong to this system, when what he did best was not what the team wanted to exploit the most, and that feeling created a silent unease when he realized that success did not mean safety, that just a small change in tactics, a decision from the coaching staff, everything he had built could disappear quickly. And that very thing made the first years in the NFL become a paradox. When, on the outside, Bettis was praised, recognized, seen as one of the best rookies. But on the inside, he still lived with the feeling that nothing had ever really been certain, that his position could still be replaced, that his body might still not keep up with what this league demanded. There were moments when he stood on the field, among thousands of fans, under bright lights, but still felt an unexplainable emptiness. Not because he was not successful, but because he had never felt he completely controlled it. When every game was still a challenge, every collision still carried risk, and every team decision could still change everything. And perhaps the most heartbreaking thing about this period was not the difficulties he had to face, but the fact that he had achieved what many dreamed of, but still could not find peace in it. When success came too fast, too big, but not deep enough to erase the doubts that had existed before, and not solid enough to make him believe that he had really arrived where he belonged. Bettis did not fail in Los Angeles, but he was also not truly freed, because behind the titles and the numbers, there was still a question without an answer, a feeling that everything he had could only be temporary, that one day this world would realize what it had doubted from the beginning, and that his body, with all its limitations, would ultimately not be able to keep up. And when a person begins to live with the feeling that his success may not be sustainable, then every step forward, instead of bringing confidence, brings a silent worry, a worry that everything he has is just an illusion, a short moment before everything collapses. And it was precisely in that instability that Jerome Bettis continued to move forward, not like a person who had won, but like a person who was still trying to hold on to what he had achieved. Day by day, game by game, run by run. And then, what Jerome Bettis had always feared finally happened, not in a dramatic moment on the field, not in a collision that knocked him down, but in a cold decision made behind the meeting room door, when the Los Angeles Rams decided to trade him away, even though he had just gone 2 seasons with achievements that any player could be proud of, even though he had proven that he could run, could endure, could contribute, but all of that was still not enough to keep him there. Because in this world, what you could do was not as important as whether you fit what they wanted or not. And Bettis, with everything he was still not the model they were looking for. There was no cheering, no emotional farewell, only an announcement, a change, a period ending for a phase where he had thought he had finally found his place, and in that moment, everything he had built seemed more fragile than ever. As if his success had never really belonged to him, but was only something temporary that could be taken away at any time without explanation. The feeling of being replaced did not come as a big shock, but came as a confirmation of the fears he had carried his whole life, that no matter how hard you tried, no matter what you proved, there would still be a time when the world decided that you were no longer needed, and that not only took away his position, but also took away a part of the confidence he had taken so long to build. There were days after that when Bettis did not think about football, did not think about the games or the numbers, but only thought about a simple but heavy question. If everything he did was still not enough, then what else did he have to do? And that question had no clear answer, because it was not only related to his career, but related to the person he was, to whether he was really worthy of everything he had pursued or not. Being traded was not just a change of teams, but a shake to his identity, when he was no longer the person the Rams trusted, no longer the name built in their system, but became a person being moved, an asset being exchanged, a number in a deal that he had no control over, and that made him face a reality that no player wanted to admit, that in this world, you could be replaced more easily than you thought. The risk of being forgotten was not something distant, but a very real, very close possibility, when each season that passed brought new faces, faster, younger, more suitable to the trend of the game. And if you're no longer in the right place at the right time, you could disappear from the story without anyone really noticing. And Bettis understood that better than anyone, because he had spent his whole life fighting to be seen, to not be considered unnecessary, and now he stood again before the risk of returning to the exact position he had tried to escape. The days after that had no lights, no cheers, only silence and repeating thoughts, when he had to ask himself whether everything he had been through had led to this or not, whether this was the point where his story stopped, not because he did not try, but because he was not enough to continue. And it was precisely in that doubt that Bettis had to face a choice he had faced before, but this time heavier, more real, and much more difficult, which was whether he would accept what others thought of him or continue to fight to prove that they were wrong. There was nothing guaranteeing that there would be a second chance, nothing certain that he would find another place, another team, another system willing to trust him. And that very uncertainty made everything more frightening when the future was no longer clear, when the road ahead was no longer laid out, and when every decision could be the final step. But if there was one thing that the years before had taught Bettis, it was that being pushed out of one place did not mean you had run out of chances, but only meant that you had to find another path. And although at that time he did not know where that path would lead, did not know if he could stand up once more or not, he knew one single thing, that if he stopped here, then everything he had endured, everything he had overcome, would become meaningless. And that very thought, though small, though fragile, was still enough to keep him there, enough for him to continue moving forward, even when everything around him was saying that it was time to stop. And then, right when everything seemed to be falling into that undefined emptiness, another opportunity appeared, not like a promise, but like a new challenge. When Jerome Bettis was brought to the Pittsburgh Steelers, a team that carried a completely different identity, a place where strength, stubbornness, and fighting spirit were not just advantages but requirements. But even when that door opened, Bettis did not step in as someone welcomed like a star. He stepped in as someone who had to start all over again from the beginning, carrying the cracks of the past, carrying the feeling of being discarded that had not yet had time to heal, and carrying a question that never had an answer about whether this time would be different or not. The first days in Pittsburgh had no certainty, no guarantees, only work, only training sessions, and a body that had never really cooperated easily. And Bettis understood that if there was any chance to survive here, he would have to rebuild everything, not from what he had once achieved, but from what he could prove right at that moment, in every training session, every run, every collision. And it was precisely in that environment that something began to change. Not immediately, not loudly, but gradually, when Bettis stopped trying to become a version that fit others' standards and began to become himself, without hiding his weight, without hiding his sweetness, but using it, turning it into part of his playing style, something that no one could copy, when each of his runs was not to avoid, but to confront, to push through, to drive back those standing in front of him. And gradually, the name The Bus began to appear, not as a fancy nickname, but as the most accurate description of how he played the game, a machine that was not fast, not light, but almost impossible to stop once it had started. But building that image was not easy at all, because every game was still a test. Every mistake could still send everything back to the starting line. And Bettis did not forget that. He did not allow himself to feel too safe, because he had known how quickly everything could be lost, and that very caution made him continue working, continue proving, not to impress, but to survive. Gradually, those around him began to see him differently, no longer as the person discarded from somewhere else, but as a part of this team, a person who could bring stability, a person who could be trusted when needed. And from there, his role began to change. From a player who had to prove himself to a pillar, a person the team could rely on in difficult moments, and that not only changed how others saw him, but also changed how he saw himself. But that confidence did not come like an explosion, but came little by little, through every game, every time he stood up after a collision, every time his body seemed unable to endure but still continued. And it was precisely in those moments that Bettis began to realize that his weaknesses were no longer something to hide, but could become what made the difference. That not being the fastest did not mean being ineffective. That not being perfect did not mean being unable to succeed. And perhaps the most important thing he learned in this period was not how to play the game better, but how to accept himself, not as an ideal version, but as a real human being, with all the limitations, all the difficulties, but also with the ability to overcome those things in his own way. Pittsburgh did not heal all the wounds that Bettis carried, but it gave him a chance to rebuild, to turn what once made him doubted into what made him trusted. And in that process, one thing became clearer than ever, that his journey had not ended, that being discarded was not the end point, but only a part of the story, a necessary part so that he could become the person he was gradually becoming. A person who no longer ran away from his own limitations, but learned to carry them with him, and continued to move forward, step by step, yard by yard, in a world that he had never been created to dominate. But somehow, he was still finding his place. But even when Jerome Bettis had found his place with the Pittsburgh Steelers, when the name "the Bus" began to become a symbol of strength and resilience, there was still a truth that he could never escape that quietly existed, which was that his body had never really stood on his side. It was not a perfect tool to serve his dream, but more like a battlefield where every day he had to fight to keep it working, where every breath, every run had to be paid for. And even though outsiders only saw the powerful charges, the collisions that made opponents bounce back, they did not see what happened afterward, when the game ended, when the lights went out, and when Bettis had to face his own body in a state of exhaustion. Asthma had never disappeared. It was not defeated by titles, not erased by success. It only changed the way it appeared, becoming quieter but no less dangerous. When there were moments in games when his breathing became heavy, when his lungs could not keep up with the pace of the game, when every inhale carried a feeling of tension, as if his body was reminding him that the limits were still there, that no matter how far he went, he still could not run away from it. And it was not only asthma. The injuries began to accumulate through each season, not as big falls that immediately ended everything, but as small, quiet cracks that built up over time. Every collision left a mark. Every time he stood up was a time his body had to endure more pressure, and gradually those marks no longer disappeared but became part of him, part of the way he moved, the way he felt, and the way he endured. There were mornings when Bettis woke up with a heavy body, not because he did not want to get up, but because his body needed time to remember how to function, when every joint, every muscle reacted slower, more painfully, and sometimes just stepping out of bed itself became a small challenge that no one saw, no one recorded, but was an indispensable part of the life he had to accept. After every game, when fans went home with excitement, when the scoreboard had been recorded, Bettis stepped into another world where there was no cheering, no lights, only silence and pain. When his body began to react to what it had just gone through, when every collision was returned with lingering, prolonged aches, when sitting down, standing up, or even lying still was no longer simple, and in those moments he was no longer a star, no longer the bus, but only a human trying to keep his body from collapsing. To be able to continue, Bettis had to learn to control his body strictly, not as a choice, but as a necessity. From diet, rest time, to training methods, everything had to be calculated, with no room for randomness, no room for letting go, because just one small mistake and his body could react in a way he could not control. And in a league like the NFL, that could mean the end. But even when he could control many things, there was one thing he could never change, which was that he never stepped into a game in completely healthy condition. There was always some pain, some weakness, some limit that he had to carry with him. And that made every time he took the field, not just a decision to play, but a decision to accept risk, to accept that his body might not hold up, to accept that each game could take away a part of him that would never come back. And perhaps what made Bettis's journey so heavy was not facing strong opponents, but facing his own body, a body that never fully cooperated, a body that always set limits, and a body that he could not replace, could not leave behind, but could only carry with him, day after day, game after game. But it was precisely in that war that something special formed, not invincibility, but a resilience that few could understand. When Bettis did not play because he felt no pain, but played even though he was in pain, did not continue because he was sure he would succeed, but continued because he refused to stop. And in a way, the very fact that his body was always in a state of fighting had made him a true warrior, not because he had no limits, but because he had learned to live with them and still move forward, step by step, yard by yard, in a war that no one saw clearly but decided everything. And when the war with his body had become so familiar that it could not be separated, another burden began to form, heavier and quieter. When Jerome Bettis was no longer just a player trying to survive on the field, but became one of the pillars of the Pittsburgh Steelers, a person that teammates looked to when things got difficult, a person that coaches trusted to give the most important moments, and a person that fans expected to always stand firm no matter the circumstances, and that very change made his war no longer take place only inside his body, but spread to the entire role he had to carry. Becoming a leader was not a title that was given, but a responsibility he had to live with every day. When young players looked to him for stability, when they needed a guide, a person who could show them that it was possible to overcome limits, that it was possible to continue even when things were not perfect. And Bettis, with everything he had been through, became that image, not because he had no weaknesses, but because he had learned to stand firm despite having weaknesses. But becoming a support for others also meant that he no longer had much space for himself. When every decision, every play, every mistake carried bigger consequences, not only affecting him personally, but also the whole team, the people who trusted him, and that created a pressure that not everyone could see, because it did not lie in the numbers, but in the feeling of always having to be right, always having to be stable, always having to be the person others could rely on. Fans did not see the mornings when he had to struggle to get up. They did not feel the pain he carried. They only saw a person in a Steelers jersey step onto the field and expected him to do what he always did, to keep moving forward, to keep fighting, to keep delivering results. And that expectation, though unspoken, was always present, always weighing on his shoulders in every game, every season. Bettis understood that in his position, a mistake was not just a mistake, but a disappointment, something he did not allow himself to make, because he knew clearly the feeling when one moment could change everything, when one wrong decision could make all efforts meaningless, and because of that, he began to live with a stricter standard, not set by others, but created by himself. A standard that allowed no looseness, no carelessness, no relying on luck. But living in that state was not easy, because the pressure did not disappear after each game. It did not decrease over time. On the contrary, it accumulated, little by little, through each season, through each new expectation, through each time he had to prove again that he was still worthy of that role, and gradually, the tension became part of life, something he could not avoid, could not leave behind, but could only carry with him, just like the way he carried physical pain. But this time, it was not clearly visible, could not be seen, could not be measured, but only existed in thoughts, in silent moments when he wondered if he could continue to maintain all of this or not. There were nights when Bettis could not sleep, not because his body hurt, but because his mind did not allow him to rest. When he thought about what had happened, what could happen, what he needed to do so as not to disappoint everyone. And in those moments, he was no longer a player on the field, but a human trying to keep everything from collapsing, trying to balance what he could do and what he was expected to do. And perhaps what made this period so heavy was not that he had to take responsibility, but that he could not escape it, could not put it down, could not say that he needed rest. Because in this world, when you are the person others rely on, you do not have many choices other than to continue even when you are tired, to continue even when you are not sure you still have enough strength, to continue because you know that if you stop, many things will stop with you. And it was precisely in that continuation, in carrying the burden with no way to unload it, that Jerome Bettis gradually became something bigger than a player. Not because he had no limits, but because he had learned to live with those limits and still stood firm, still moved forward, even when the burden on his shoulders grew bigger and bigger, and there was no sign that it would get lighter. And then, when all the burdens had accumulated to the point where they could not get any heavier, when Jerome Bettis had become the anchor of the Pittsburgh Steelers, when every run of his was not just about himself, but also about the belief of an entire collective, the moment he feared the most finally arrived, not as a long chain of failures, but contained in a brief second, a moment where everything could change forever. In the 2005 playoff game, when the Steelers were moving close to an important victory, when all eyes were on the field and when Bettis, the person always trusted in crucial situations, held the ball in his hands, preparing to do what he had done thousands of times before, to advance, to hold firm, and to protect the advantage for his team. But this time, everything did not happen that way. In a seemingly familiar collision, the ball slipped from his hands, fell to the field, and in that moment, time seemed to stop. Not because the sound disappeared, but because all he could feel was a cold emptiness when he realized that the worst thing had happened, not to anyone else, but to himself. At the moment when he was not allowed to make a mistake, the ball rolled away, the opponent picked it up, and in just a few seconds, the advantage that the Steelers had held throughout the game stood before the risk of disappearing, and Bettis, the person who had spent his whole life proving that he could endure, that he could stand firm, suddenly became the reason that could make everything collapse. And there was no way to go back, no way to fix it immediately, only the stark truth that a single mistake could erase everything he had built. In that moment, Bettis did not think about titles, did not think about the past, did not think about what he had achieved. He only thought about one thing: that he had let the team down, that he had let slip away what everyone had trusted him with, and that feeling was not a brief shock, but a wave that swept through his entire body, making everything inside him sink, making him face the fear he had carried his whole life, that one day people would realize he was not enough, that he would be the one who made the mistake, that he would be the reason everything ended. When the opponent charged with the ball, when the fans held their breath, when his teammates tried to chase to salvage the situation, Bettis stood there, not because he did not want to run, but because in that moment he was held back by his own thoughts, by the feeling of guilt that came faster than any reflex. And in those few brief seconds, he had experienced what no player wanted to experience, which was seeing the worst scenario of himself become reality. And even when the situation afterward was salvaged, even when the team did not lose everything as he feared, for Bettis that did not change the feeling he had gone through, because in his mind that moment had been enough to break something, enough to make him doubt himself, doubt everything he had built, and doubt whether he was truly worthy of the role he held or not. There were mistakes that could be forgotten over time, but there were mistakes that did not need real consequences to still haunt. And this was one of them. When Bettis realized that effort was not always enough, that will was not always able to protect you from the moments when everything went beyond control, and that very awareness made the pain deeper, because it was not just about one play, but about the fragility of everything he had built. After that situation, he did not need anyone to say anything, did not need anyone to blame him, because the harshest critic was right inside him, repeating that moment, analyzing it, questioning it, and not allowing him to forget it, not allowing him to overlook it, as if he had to hold himself accountable for it, as if that was the price he had to pay for believing he could control everything. And perhaps what made this moment so painful was not that he had fumbled the ball, but that he realized everything he had tried to avoid his whole life, all the fears about not being good enough, about being replaced, about becoming the one who made the mistake, could happen in just 1 second, without warning, without preparation, and without being reversible. In that moment, Jerome Bettis was no longer the bus, no longer the symbol of strength, but only a human standing in the middle of the field, facing his mistake, facing his fear, and facing a truth he could not deny, that sometimes everything you build can be challenged by a single moment, and the only thing you can do is face it, no matter how painful it is. After that moment, when the stadium gradually emptied and the noisy sounds receded into the background, Jerome Bettis stepped into a space with no lights, no cheers, only silence and thoughts that could not stop. And it was precisely in that silence that the game did not end. It only shifted to another form, where he no longer faced opponents but faced himself, with the image of the ball slipping from his hands, with the moment when he had failed to do what everyone trusted him to do, and that repeated in his mind, non-stop, without rest, as if every time he thought about it was a time he had to relive that feeling, a feeling he could not erase, could not change, and could not escape. In the locker room, surrounded by teammates trying to handle their own emotions. But for Bettis, there was nothing clear except one single thing: that he had let them down, that even though the game had not ended in the worst way, that moment still existed, still was a crack he could not pretend had never happened. And that made him not need anyone to blame him, because the greatest blame had come from himself, from the way he looked back at every detail, every decision, every movement, as if he analyzed it deeply enough he could find some way to change it, even though he knew that was impossible. The shame did not come as an explosive emotion, but as a layer that grew heavier, pressing on his thoughts, on his feelings, on the way he saw himself, when he began to wonder whether everything he had done before still had meaning or not, whether the years of enduring, the games overcome through pain, the time standing up after collisions still held any value if one moment could overshadow all of it. And that very question made him feel smaller than ever, not because he was no longer strong, but because he realized that strength could not protect him from mistakes. There were moments when Bettis thought about retiring, not as a big decision, but as a fleeting thought, but clear enough that maybe this was the time to stop, that maybe he had gone far enough, had endured enough, and did not need to continue putting himself in situations where one mistake could make everything meaningless. And that thought was not weakness, but fatigue, the fatigue of a person who had had to fight for too long, too much, and was beginning to feel the price of never stopping. But even in those moments there was something that did not allow him to completely let go. Not certain belief, not strong confidence, but a memory, a feeling that had followed him from the first years, from when he was still a boy who had to fight to breathe, from when he learned to stand firm in an imperfect body. And that very memory reminded him that he had once been in darker places than this, had once faced harsher limits and still continued. Bettis did not find the answer immediately. He did not walk out of that night with clarity or release. But he began to realize that that mistake, no matter how big, still could not erase his entire journey, that it was a part of the story, not the end of it. And realizing that did not make the pain disappear, but it created enough space for him to breathe, enough for him to think about continuing, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he was not ready to end it that way. That night did not bring comfort, did not bring relief, but it brought something else, a straightforward confrontation with himself, without protection, without image, without titles, only a human left with his mistakes, with his fears, and with one single question he had to answer for himself, not for anyone else, but for himself, whether he could stand up once more or not, whether he could step onto the field and continue, even knowing that mistake would always be there, always be a part of him. And in the silence of that night, when there was no one around, when there was nothing left to hide, Jerome Bettis did not find certainty. But he found something enough to keep him there, a small but strong enough reason that his story had not ended, that he was not ready to let one moment define his entire life. And even though the road ahead was not clear, even though the pain was still there, he still decided to continue. Not because he did not feel the burden, but because he had grown used to carrying it with him and still moved forward. And then, after the longest night when Jerome Bettis had to face himself, when all the emotions had settled enough for him to see more clearly what was ahead, he made a decision that was not loud, did not need any announcement, but carried the weight of an entire journey. He would not stop, not because he was not tired, not because he was not afraid, but because he was not ready for his story to end that way, not ready for one mistake to become the period at the end of everything he had been through. And it was precisely in that decision that a new phase began, not a phase of ambition, but a phase of clarity, when he understood that his time was no longer plentiful, that his body no longer allowed long years ahead, and that every game from here on was not just a part of the season, but could be a part of the ending. Bettis did not return with the mindset of a person who wanted to prove something to the world, but with a different mindset, quieter, more focused, when he began to prepare for the final journey of his career, not with big promises, but with small actions. Every training session, every recovery exercise, every way he took care of his body more carefully than ever, because he knew that if he wanted to continue, he could not treat his body as before, could not push it to the limit without thinking about the consequences, but had to learn to listen, to control, to maintain what was left. His spirit also changed, no longer dominated by doubts or pressure as before. Not because those things disappeared, but because he had seen them more clearly, had accepted that they would always exist, and instead of trying to eliminate them, he chose to carry them with him, but not let them decide his actions. And that very change made every time he stepped onto the field become different, not easier, but clearer, when he knew exactly what he was doing, why he was still here, and how far he could still go. Every game began to carry a different meaning, no longer a part of an endless chain, but became a moment that might not repeat, an opportunity he could not take for granted when he stepped onto the field with the awareness that this could be the last time he ran through a defense, the last time he felt the weight of the game, the last time he stood with his teammates in a moment when everyone was heading toward one goal, and that very awareness made him play with a focus that not everyone could achieve, not because he was stronger, but because he knew clearly where he was in his journey. But understanding his own limits did not make everything easier. It only made everything more real, when he knew that his body might not respond in any moment, that the pains would still come, that the fatigue would still accumulate, and that every time he took the field was still a risk. But instead of fearing that, he accepted it as a part of the game, a part of the price he had chosen to pay long before. There were games where Bettis was no longer the one who ran the most, no longer the center of every play, but that did not make him feel less important, because he understood that his role had changed, that his value did not only lie in the yards gained, but in the presence, in the experience, in the ability to keep the team's spirit steady in difficult moments. And that very thing helped him continue, not like a person trying to hold on to the past, but like a person completing a journey. Every run of his from here on no longer carried the pressure to prove, but carried a calmness, an acceptance that everything was gradually coming to an end, and instead of resisting that, he chose to go with it, to make use of every remaining opportunity, every remaining game, every remaining game, every remaining moment, as if that was the last thing he could do in his career. And perhaps what made this phase special was not what he achieved, but the way he approached it, no longer in a hurry, no longer trying to overcome every limit, but a balance between continuing and accepting, between fighting and understanding that not every battle had to be won. And it was precisely in that balance that Jerome Bettis found something he had never had before. Not certainty, but calmness, a feeling that no matter what happened next, he was ready to face it, not as a perfect person, but as a human who had gone through enough to understand that sometimes continuing was not to achieve anything more, but to end a journey in a way he could accept. And then that journey, after everything Jerome Bettis had been through, did not take him to a strange place, but brought him back to the exact place where everything had once begun. When Super Bowl 40 was held in Detroit, the city that had witnessed the first days of a boy struggling to breathe, a boy no one believed could go this far, and now that very place had become the stage for the biggest game of his life. Not just a Super Bowl, but a complete circle of everything he had ever experienced. But returning did not bring relief. It brought a pressure that nowhere else could create, because here he was not just an NFL player, he was a son of this city, a person that every eye looked at, not only with the expectation of victory, but with all the memories, the stories, the things they had witnessed since he was still a boy. And that very thing made every step of his heavier when he carried not only the weight of the game, but also the weight of the past. When he stepped onto the field, Bettis did not only see opponents, did not only see teammates, but also saw familiar images of a life that had passed, the streets he had once walked, the places he had once stood, the moments when he had once doubted himself, and all of those things did not disappear, but were present clearer than ever, as if reminding him that this was not just a game, but an opportunity to face everything that had shaped the person he had become. The pressure of playing in front of his hometown was unlike any pressure he had ever experienced. It did not come from opponents, did not come from tactics, but came from the feeling that he was not allowed to let everything end the wrong way, that he was not allowed to let his story return to the starting point with an incomplete ending. And that very thought made every moment on the field more tense when he had to maintain focus while his mind constantly reminded him of everything that was behind. But when the game began, when everything moved, Bettis no longer had time to think about the past or the future. He only had the present, every play, every run, every decision, and in those moments all that he had learned, all that he had been through, began to come together, not like an explosion, but like a stability, a certainty that he had taken many years to build when he no longer tried to do something beyond his ability, but only did what he could do best, within his limits, with everything he had. As the game moved gradually toward the end, as victory began to become clearer, Bettis did not celebrate immediately, did not run with emotion, but stood there, as if trying to understand what was happening, as if he needed a moment to accept that everything he had gone through had finally led here. And when the final whistle sounded, when the Steelers officially won, when the dream became reality, he did not just win a title but gain something deeper, a closure that he had been searching for his whole life. But what made that moment special was not the trophy, not the title, but the place where it happened. Because it did not occur anywhere else but in Detroit, the place where he had once been a boy who could not breathe, where he had once been limited by his own body, where he had once not known how far he could go, and now that very place was where he ended his journey at the peak. Not like a perfect story, but like a journey that had gone through enough pain to become complete. When Bettis decided to retire after that game, it was not a quiet withdrawal, but a conscious choice, a decision that he had gone far enough, had done enough, and had found a way to end his story in a way he could accept. Not because he could no longer continue, but because he no longer needed to continue. And perhaps what made this part of the story heavy was not the victory itself, but everything it represented, because it was not just a title, but a confirmation that all the years he had fought with his body, with his fears, with the doubts of others, were not meaningless. That the journey, though not perfect, though full of moments when he thought he would collapse, had still led to a point where he could look back and say that he had not stopped, even when everything said he should. And when the lights of Super Bowl 40 gradually faded, when the cheers died down and the jerseys were put away, Jerome Bettis stepped into a phase he had not really prepared for throughout his playing years, a life without collisions, without plays, without the pressure to prove himself on the field. but carrying an emptiness that only those who had lived under the lights could understand. Because when an entire life had been defined by continuing to move forward, stopping was not a simple rest, but a profound change in the way of existing. The first days after retirement had no training schedule, no game plans, no tactical meetings. And in that silence, Bettis began to realize that there were parts of life he had missed, not because he did not care, but because he had no time. When every day before had revolved around preparing for the next game, for the next season, for the next goal. And now that all of that was gone, he had to learn to live without them. Family became the center of the new life, not as something luxurious, but as a part he had always had, but had never really given enough time to when he began to be with his children more. Not like a person who only appeared in rare moments, but like a real father who was present, listening, sharing, and in those simple moments he found a different kind of meaning. Not loud, not recorded by the crowd, but profound in a way that football could not bring. But leaving the field did not mean he completely left behind what he had built. When Bettis began to participate in community activities, charity programs, not as an obligation, but as a way to use what he had to create something for others, especially children growing up in circumstances similar to what he had experienced, children whose dreams could be limited by things they could not control. And in helping them, Bettis seemed to be looking back at himself, looking back at the boy who once had to fight to breathe, who had once been doubted, who had once not been seen as suitable, and realizing that his journey had meaning not only for himself, but could also become something bigger. But beneath all of that, there was an awareness that gradually became clearer over time, an awareness of what he had been through, of the price he had paid when his body, though no longer having to endure collisions like before, still carried the marks of those years, the pains that did not completely disappear, the sensations that just one wrong movement could remind him of the past. And it was precisely in those moments that he began to understand more clearly the value of health, not as something obvious, but as something he had traded too much to have. Looking back at his career, Bettis did not only see the victories, the titles, the glorious moments, but also saw the sleepless nights, the painful mornings, the moments when he was not sure he could continue, and that truth did not make him regret, but made him see everything differently. When he realized that football had given him so much, but had also taken away so much, and balancing between the two was not always clear while he was still playing. There were times when he wondered if he had known everything that would happen beforehand, whether he would have chosen this path or not. And the answer was not always simple, not an absolute affirmation, but an acceptance that every choice came with its price. And he had chosen his path, had gone all the way through it, and now he had to learn to live with what was left. But perhaps the most important thing Bettis realized in this phase was not what he had lost, but what he still had: a family, a life off the field, an opportunity to exist without having to fight in every moment. And that very thing, though it did not bring the excitement of the playing days, brought a peace he had never had before, a peace that did not come from winning but from no longer needing to prove anything. And in that peace, Jerome Bettis was no longer a running back, no longer the bus, but a human learning to live a different life, a life he had almost not had the chance to experience if the years before had gone in a different direction, if his body had not endured, if he had not continued. And that very awareness made every day that passed more meaningful, not because it was grand, but because it existed. And when everything that had passed settled into memory, when the cheers became only a distant echo, the story of Jerome Bettis was no longer told through numbers or titles, but through a journey that few could truly understand completely. From a boy who once struggled to breathe in the long nights in Detroit to a man standing at the peak of the NFL, not through perfection, but through an endurance that not everyone could see. He had never been the fastest on the field, had never been the ideal model that coaches drew, had never been the player who made people marvel at lightness or speed. But he was the person whose every run carried something that could not be measured by statistics. That was will, that was stubbornness, that was the ability to continue even when his body had said it should have stopped long before. There were people who won because they were born with everything they needed, while Bettis won because he did not have those things, and that very lack forced him to build a different path, a path not based on excelling but based on never disappearing, never accepting being eliminated, never letting one moment define his entire self. The asthma attacks did not disappear, the injuries did not naturally heal, the doubts did not automatically stop. All of them were still there, going with him through every phase, every game, every decision. But what changed was not the circumstances but the way he faced them, when he no longer tried to run away from the limits but learned to carry them with him, to turn them into part of himself, and to continue moving forward. Bettis's legacy did not lie in how many yards he had run, did not lie in how many times he scored, but lay in the way he had existed in an environment where everything seemed not created for him, the way he had stood firm in moments when others might have collapsed, and the way he had continued, not because he did not know fatigue, but because he refused to stop. Perhaps what made his story special was not the ending at Super Bowl 40, but everything that had happened before it. All the times he had to start over, all the times he had been doubted, all the times he had to ask himself whether he could keep going or not, and still chose to continue. Not because he was certain, but because he had no other choice except to take one more step. And if there was one image that could capture everything he represented, then it was not the moment he lifted the trophy, but the image of a man still running, not to escape anything, but to move forward, even though what lay ahead was not clear, even though his body was not perfect, even though the journey had taken away so much, but still enough to continue. Jerome Bettis was not a legend because he had never failed, but because he had never stopped. And in a world that always honors perfection, his story reminds us that sometimes the greatest thing is not winning, but that you are still standing there, still moving forward after everything that has happened, and still continuing to run even when no one requires you to do it anymore. The story of Jerome Bettis is not simply a journey of victory, but a painful record of a human who had to fight with his own body to exist. And that makes people unable to help but feel heartache when looking back at the details that unfolded throughout the story. From the childhood nights in Detroit, when he struggled with every breath because of asthma, to the moment he was discarded by the Los Angeles Rams even though he was playing well. Then the fumble that almost destroyed his entire career in the 2005 playoff game, all of them showed a heartbreaking truth. There are people who have to pay more than others just to stand on equal ground. What makes this story worthy of appreciation does not lie in the victory at Super Bowl 40, but lies in the fact that he still continued to step onto the field even though he was never truly healthy, still carried the role of leader while his body continuously betrayed him, and still stood up after the mistake that he himself believed could erase everything. For the people of the United States, where success is often tied to talent and speed, Bettis's journey is a profound reminder that real value does not lie in being better than others, but in not giving up when everything is against you. His life shows that adversity is not something that prevents success, but is precisely what defines it. And in a society that always demands quick results, this story reminds us that there are victories that require an entire lifetime of endurance to achieve. And sometimes the thing most worth being proud of is not how far you have gone, but that you did not stop when you had every reason to do so. If the story of Jerome Bettis makes you feel the power of resilience, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to honor a man who never stopped moving forward even while carrying so much pain. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore imperfect journeys but full of strength, just like life itself.